Okay, in this part of the lecture, we're going to talk a bit about characteristics of sex offenders and particularly some of the candidate variables that might be related to causes of sex offending. I often start out by asking students what they think a typical sex offender is like, the key characteristics they think of, and I always get entertained by the huge variety of answers. Sometimes students take it very seriously, provide very informed answers. I think the first time I asked students, a student popped their hand up right away. This was about 10 years ago and said mustaches. This was before mustaches were ironically cool. So yeah, so lots of different things that you might think of for a sex offender. Some people have a stereotype of, a creepy old man. Some people think about kind of a young Paul Bernardo rapist, or Ted Bundy Ted Bundy type of person. All sorts of different things that people think about. One of the stereotypes I often think about is Herbert the pervert from Family Guy, although I get told that that reference is becoming less and less accessible to today's youth, which is unfortunate. The textbook talks about many, many different typologies of sex offenders against adults or children, and there will be some coverage of that on the final exam. I'm not going to cover them in great detail. I think the textbook does more than enough of that already. In a lot of the research, it tends to focus mostly on typologies, roughly dividing offenders based on the types of victims they target. So a lot of research will separate out offenders who have victimized against adults versus children. So often just the simplest distinction is rapists versus child molesters. However, among child molesters, other research distinguishes between extrafamilial versus intrafamilial. So extrafamilial tends to be if they've offended against at least one unrelated child, whereas intrafamilial child molesters are those who have only offended against children in their family, children, grandchildren, stepchildren, maybe nieces or nephews, and they're typically referred to as incest offenders. And there's evidence that incest offenders in particular can be quite different than other types of sex offenders. There's also non-contact sex offenders. They typically, most commonly, are exhibitionists or voyeurs. So those might be kind of peeping toms or people who hang out in public places and get aroused by exposing their genitals, and can be very frightening and off-putting to the people who see them. But they might have it tends to be low rates of contact or violence or injury against the victims. These tend to be higher frequency offenders. They commit these types of behaviors much more frequently. There's also a new category we'll talk about briefly at the end of today's lecture for online sex offenders. So they commit their sex offenses online, and there's actually a huge variety of different types of online offenses that can be committed with varying levels of coercion involved. Um, Okay. Another comment I would make is that even these types of distinctions are not very clear cut. There tends to be a lot of gray area in between. There's a non-trivial proportion of offenders who tend to commit sex offenses in multiple categories. So there are sex offenders, a good number, who will commit non-contact and contact sex offenses. There's some sex offenders who will commit offenses against adults and children. So while it can be useful to make these distinctions, as I've talked about, can be useful for a lot of the typologies as well. Just note that not everyone falls cleanly into these groups, and you do expect some overlap. And even there's differences in the research in how people define children. What's a child molester versus a rapist? Some studies define it as kind of, maybe less than 13 or 14 are children. That might be focusing more purely on kind of prepubescent children. In some areas where age of sexual consent is 18, they'd be considering all the way up to 18 as children, whereas the types of offenders that would commit offenses against, for example, 16, 17-year-olds might be very different than those who are committing offenses against 6 and 7-year-olds. So what we define as a child can also be quite important for this research. So I would normally, and you can maybe take a moment to reflect on, what do you think some of the key causes of sex offending are? We've talked about in this course all sorts of risk factors, kind of biological risk factors, early developmental risk factors, childhood risk factors that describe kind of crime of all types. But sex offending has some particularly unique types of risk factors. And I do want to make a couple preliminary comments before we dive into what some of them are. One is an important reminder on the definition of etiological risk factors versus recidivism risk factors or reoffending risk factors. Um, Etiological risk factors are factors that can explain why someone starts to commit offending, or or basically predicts who starts to commit sex offending. It doesn't necessarily predict who continues to reoffend after they've already been caught. So there can be considerable overlap, but the factors that predict onset of criminal behavior aren't always the same as the factors that predict continuation of criminal behavior. So that caveat in place, and similar to other things that we've talked about, a lot of the factors that we can identify that predict onset of criminal behavior don't necessarily mean that there's a causal relationship. Maybe there's some other variable that causes both. Um, but it's kind of, a useful starting point. And so the way we identify etiological risk factors, so factors that predict onset of criminal behavior, such as sex offending, is we essentially compare people who have committed sex offenses to people who haven't, and factors on which they differ are factors that would predict who is more likely to commit a sex offense. So people tend to have all sorts of thoughts or reasons on why people commit sex offenses. Some of the common ones I hear about is potentially they were sexually abused themselves as a child. They don't have adequate kind of social skills to attract an appropriate partner, so they turn to sex offending. They're psychopathic. There's all sorts of reasons that could explain it. For some reason, one of the strongest etiological risk factors tends to be not often mentioned by students, and that's deviant sexual interests. So sometimes the simplest explanation is can be one of the most important, and that's people who commit sex offenses are turned on by sexually deviant or inappropriate stimuli. So that's their, committing these inappropriate behavior because that's what their sexual preference or interest is in. Most people tend to be most interested in kind of fairly healthy consenting sexual behavior. They're not interested in sex if their partner's not enjoying it as well. And particularly, most people are not sexually aroused by children, so they're not going to seek out sexual contact with the child. So there is research suggesting that child molesters do have higher levels of sexual arousal to children compared to non-molesters, and that rapists have higher levels of sexual arousal to forced sex compared to non-rapists. We'll talk about, do I have it in the slide? Yeah, I'll briefly introduce this. I'll briefly introduce this now. It's not so much among rapists that they prefer rape. It's more that the violence might fail to inhibit their arousal. So for most people, if they're having sex with their partner, if their partner is obviously not into it, that tends to be a boner killer, so to speak. If their partner's saying, ouch, I'm in pain, or I don't want to do this, or partner starts to cry, it's harder for them to maintain sexual interest. Among rapists, it's not that they're out of their way going for this experience. What you tend to see with some rapists is they have high levels of consenting sexual activity as well. It's more an issue of they're interested in sex and they're just indifferent as to whether their participant is willing or not. They'll take it either way. That's in contrast, particularly in the 80s and early 90s. There was a lot of idea that rapists were particularly turned on by having power. They wanted to control their partner, or sex was not really about sex. It was about an expression of power or dominance. And there are a small portion of rapists that do tend to exhibit that, but now with later research, we understand that that's not actually the common scenario. It does seem to be about an interest in sex, and with rapists, it's more they'll take it any way they can get it. And we'll show some data on that in a moment. Hopefully one of the things you're all curious about right now is, well, how do you measure deviant sexual interests? Because if somebody's already been charged or convicted of a sex offense, if you just ask them, hey, what turns you on, they might not answer honestly. Particularly, most people know that it's not not going to be well received to say I'm sexually interested in children. So how do we actually measure deviant sexual interests? And there's three main methods. Many of you probably have not heard of PPGs, which stands for penile plethysmography. It's also sometimes referred to as phallometric assessment. So this is considered more of a biological type measure um, of, uh, of sexual interest. And when I used to work at a federal prison in Ontario, I was lucky enough to be able to get to administer some of this among the offenders. And I assure you, no offender I ever met has been looking forward to this procedure. Essentially, what happens, there's a picture here. This is one method, but the most commonly used one is a little elastic like this. An offender has to put that over the base of their penis, and then they sit in a room in a very comfortable chair by themselves, a towel nicely draped over, and there's no one in the room with them. And then either typically through headphones, they listen to descriptions of sexual encounters or other types of situations. And the little elasticy thing is actually a very precise a precise measure that can detect very small differences in the circumference of the penis. So essentially, and I think it goes without saying, this can only be used for men with a penis. So even small levels of blood headed towards the penis that are insufficient to achieve an erection, those very small levels can still be detected in tiny changes in the circumference of the penis. So yeah, increases in the blood flow there will be picked up. So they're listening to descriptions of stimuli, and then you can observe what their reactions are. And then typically there's long breaks between the different stimuli, so it returns back to what their baseline is. I'm just going to sit forward for a second. I think my cat is trying to climb behind me on the chair and curl up. I much prefer that to if he walks all over the keyboard, so we're going to give him a moment to settle in. Okay, self-report is also another measure, so that's, surveys or something, just asking people, hey, what turns you on? Easy and cheap to do, but honesty is a concern. And then I won't talk in detail, but there's lots of other indirect measures, computer tasks or other types of things that can try and detect sexual interests in a variety of ways. I'm going to show you a little bit of sorry, I'm just getting my notes organized. I'm going to show you a little bit of data from two studies on this. This is from Grant Harris and Marnie Rice, who we've talked about in some of the other lectures from their Forensic Psychiatric Center in Ontario, as where they got some of this information from. So they have a sample of child molesters over on the right side and a sample of non-offenders over here. And what they did, the bars, I'm trying to remember on this, the bars are their self-report of what they were attracted to. The solid line you can ignore. That's a different type of indirect measure of sexual interest. And then it's the broken lines up here that was the PPG assessment. So the bars are them self-reporting, and this is a different measure. And then they listen to all sorts of different descriptions, and these were the different categories they listened to. They were listening to descriptions of sex with an adult female, with a pubescent female, so maybe around 13, 14 years old, with a child female, so clearly prepubescent, with an adolescent male, with a pubescent male, and with a child male. And then they looked at their sexual response. So a couple things I want to point out. Some people might assume that child molesters are exclusively attracted to children and that all child molesters are attracted to children, but that's actually not the case, and not all child molesters are pedophiles. There's roughly 50% of them are, so there is still a fair amount of variability. But what you see is when you ask child molesters self-report what they're attracted to, they say, I'm attracted to adult females, and they might express some attraction to pubescent females, but they express low attraction to males or especially female children. But when you look at the PPG, they do show some attraction to adult females. There's definitely some attraction there, but they show the highest levels of attraction to pubescent and child females, then very low attraction to adult males, and higher attraction to males who are pubescent or children. In contrast, non-offenders, people who are not known to have committed any sex offense, show a very different pattern. They self-report that they're attracted to adult females, and the PPG data suggests that yes, they are in fact most strongly interested in adult females. One thing as well is people might assume that adult men, for example, have zero interest in pubescent females, but biologically, there's actually biologically some normality to have some interest in a female who kind of exhibits any signs of sexual maturity, in terms of minimally kind of having breasts or having started menstruating. And so what you do see is they do self-report some moderate interest in pubescent females, and they do have some response in the PPG to pubescent females, and then fairly low response. These are generally heterosexual males, generally low response to males and low response to female children. So this is an example of how the PPG data can give us helpful information on people's sexual interests. For rapists, this was a study conducted by Martin Lalumiere, who's at the University of Ottawa, and his colleagues. He worked with Grant Harris and Marnie Rice for much of his research as well. There's a sample. The diamonds here are PPG results for samples of men from the community, so not known to have committed any sex offense. The squares are violent offenders, so offenders but not sex offenders, and the triangles, oh sorry, I pointed out the wrong thing. The diamonds are the community men, and the triangles here are the rapists. The triangles are looking too similar to the diamonds for me in this lighting. And so different descriptions. One was a neutral, it wasn't about sex at all. And then they described situations that were consenting sexual scenario from the man's perspective, consenting sexual scenario from a female's perspective, and then rape from a male's perspective, rape from a female's perspective, and then non-sexual violence of a male and a female. So just, beating someone up. And so what they tended to find was the rapists tended essentially over here to have the same level of sexual response to consenting sex described from the female's perspective and rape. So the idea here is that they don't actually have a preference for rape. It's just they're turned on by sex in general, and it doesn't matter whether it's consenting or not. So that's what I was talking about before. Whereas for violent offenders and community men, what you tend to see is the highest response is for the consenting sex from the female perspective, and kind of clearly much more turned off by the description of non-consenting sex. And the fortunate news is very few people were sexually aroused by just violence in general. So sexual sadism is quite rare. So deviant sexual interest is a very important factor in understanding who commits sex offenses. Other potential etiological factors, childhood sexual abuse is one of them. Ashley Jesperson and colleagues in 2009 published a meta-analysis. So that's a combination of numerous studies kind of combined together, and they found that sex offenders do have higher rates of sexual abuse in their childhood compared to other types of offenders. And additionally, they found among child molesters, those who had been sexually abused as a child were associated or had higher levels of sexual attraction to children. So childhood sexual abuse can be a relevant factor, but it's important to say it's not for everyone. There are still lots of sex offenders who commit sex offenses who were not sexually abused as children. And of course, there were lots of people who are sexually abused as children who do not grow up to become sex offenders, especially because the rates of females are more likely to be sexually abused during childhood, but males are more likely to commit sex offenses in adulthood. So if it was just as simple as being sexually abused turns you into a sexual abuser, we'd be seeing far more adult female sex offenders, which we don't have. So the complicated ways in which childhood sexual abuse might contribute to later sexual offending is yeah, is hard to disentangle. Oh, sorry, I forgot I had this on my slide. So in their data, roughly it was about 30% of sex offenders who were predominantly or exclusively male had a history of being sexually abused in childhood. So these are much higher than the general rates of males who've been sexually abused in childhood. Psychopathy seems to be a factor related to onset of sex offending for rapists only. Child molesters have much lower rates of psychopathy than rapists, and rapists have very similar levels of psychopathy to other types of violent offenders. So that kind of callousness and lack of concern for other people might be a key component in understanding rape, but not necessarily sexual behavior with children. Heterosocial competence. So that refers to the ability to competently, assuming you're straight, so you can translate that though to whatever your preferred target of sexual interest is among adults, but it's essentially the ability to competently interact with your pool of romantic partners. So the people who are particularly shy or awkward around potential dating partners would be considered lower in heterosocial competence. And generally, what you see is this could be an explanatory factor for child molesters, but not for rapists. So child molesters tend to score lower than other types of offenders in these kind of essentially romantic social skills, whereas rapists don't have deficits in this area. They do just fine. And so part of the theory behind this was, again, that kind of if people are unable to attract a partner through kind of normal methods, they would commit sex offenses. And that there could be something to that among child molesters, but that doesn't seem to be an explanation for rapists. Another key one is attitudes and beliefs. People might commit sex offenses because they have attitudes and values that support that type of behavior. And again, it might be easy to think that's, explains everything and it's solely as simple as that, but it's one contributing factor among many. So there is research suggesting that child molesters have higher rates of beliefs, essentially, that sex with children is okay. Some of these beliefs might be things like, it's important for children to learn about sex. So it's okay for me as an adult to teach them about sex by touching them inappropriately, or to think that children have sexual motivations in their behavior when, children don't. So they might think if a child is sitting on their lap, that means the child is coming on to them in some way. So they might have these, they're often called kind of cognitive distortions. They tend to be these false beliefs that would support or justify them committing sexual behavior against children. And child molesters do tend to have higher rates of these attitudes. Among rapists, a lot of these attitudes are often referred to as rape myths, and they tend to be attitudes that often kind of support the idea that usually women as victims, that women have it coming or they deserve it in some way. So some of the ideas are that, if a woman, dresses in a low cut shirt, then she deserves what happens to her. Or if a woman is smiling and flirting too much, what does she expect is going to happen if she agrees to come home with me? Then, she's just leading me on if she doesn't have sex with me. So she might owe me sex. Those types of beliefs that would make it okay to force sex on a woman. So rapists tend to have higher rates of holding these attitudes. Somewhat related to that is attitudes of hostility towards women. So sometimes this attitudes essentially that women are the enemy, that women go out of their way to screw over men, that women shouldn't be trusted, women lie and manipulate a lot, and people who hold these beliefs, it might be more okay in their viewpoint to force sex upon women because, women are not viewed as essentially equal to men in various ways. And there's some evidence that rapists hold more of those attitudes. Interestingly, in terms of some current news, I will report with actual considerable shock, and there's a lot behind this. But a lot of the research on some of these attitudes and beliefs was conducted by a man named Kurt Bumby in the 1990s, who's contributed a lot to the field of sexual abuse prevention and managing sex offenders. And so the field was actually quite shocked in December of this year. The news broke that he has been charged himself with having committed sex offenses against adolescent males, one in the early 90s and another in the mid 2000s. So, uh, very, very shocking, and reminder that not all sex offenses can be predicted. Other possible, we've talked a little bit about biological risk factors for sex offending, and in one of our earlier lectures, we talked about some of Kelly Babshishin's research on that. Another key researcher is James Cantor. I've highlighted him before. He's done a lot of interesting research specifically looking at pedophiles. So again, not all of them have necessarily committed sex offenses against children, but they all admit to having a sexual attraction to children, and that puts them at higher risk of committing sex offenses. And essentially, so looking more globally, sex offenders in general have higher rates of brain trauma. So higher rates of having had concussions as child or potentially from car accidents. They just have higher rates of brain damage earlier on in life. And then pedophiles in particularly compared to non-pedophiles have significantly lower IQ. They have a lower verbal memory. They're significantly more likely to be left-handed, and they're also significantly shorter. They're a couple inches shorter than non-pedophiles. So some of these things are incredibly weird, and the main thing that they have in common is that they're things that tend to be largely determined before birth. So there is this idea that there is some kind of neurodevelopmental cause of pedophilia that happens while the mother is pregnant or possibly even before that. And so the good news in some of that research is if we can better understand some of these underlying causes of pedophilia, we might be able to reduce pedophilia and thereby reduce sexual abuse of children through things like prenatal care. And addressing some of the key causal factors of pedophilia. And that's the end of part 2 of this lecture.